They say every family carries a secret, a quiet inheritance passed from blood to blood, like a shadow stitched to their name, waiting for the day it is revealed. And tonight, as you lean in closer, I want you to hear this story not with your ears, but with the pulse in your chest, because it is about a family that buried its weapon for generations, a weapon not forged of steel or gunpowder but of cunning, patience, and memory, sharpened on betrayal until it gleamed like glass, invisible yet deadly. Their name was Karamat, once wealthy landlords turned businessmen, their empire built not on hard work but on exploitation. The kind of men who could make a whole village starve, while they dined on gold-plated plates. And at the head of this dynasty stood Malik Rauf Karamat, a man with a smile too charming for the cruelty it concealed, a man who believed that loyalty could be bought, silence could be forced, and justice could be delayed forever. But what he didn't know was that within his own bloodline, within the women he dismissed, within the sons he underestimated, within the branches of the family tree he tried to prune, lay the seeds of his ruin, and those seeds were watered with the tears of the forgotten. Years ago, Malik Rauf had stolen not only land but dignity from his own younger brother, disinheriting him, driving him to ruin, forcing his widow and children. They say every family carries a secret, a quiet inheritance passed from blood to blood, like a shadow stitched to their name, waiting for the day it is revealed. And tonight, as you lean in closer, I want you to hear this story not with your ears, but with the pulse in your chest, because it is about a family that buried its weapon for generations, a weapon not forged of steel or gunpowder, but of cunning, patience, and memory, sharpened on betrayal until it gleamed like glass, invisible yet deadly. Their name was Karamat, once wealthy landlords turned businessmen, their empire built not on hard work but on exploitation. The kind of men who could make a whole village starve, while they dined on gold-plated plates. And at the head of this dynasty stood Malik Rauf Karamat, a man with a smile too charming for the cruelty it concealed, a man who believed that loyalty could be bought, silence could be forced, and justice could be delayed forever. But what he didn't know was that within his own bloodline, within the women he dismissed, within the sons he underestimated, within the branches of the family tree he tried to prune, lay the seeds of his ruin, and those seeds were watered with the tears of the forgotten. Years ago, Malik Rauf had stolen not only land but dignity from his own younger brother, disinheriting him, driving him to ruin, forcing his widow and children into exile. And though the world forgot them, the children did not forget, the daughter into exile. And though the world forgot them, the children did not forget, the daughter, Zoya, carried the humiliation like a brand on her skin, and her brother, Saif, carried their mother's last words like a curse. One day, our silence will be the blade that cuts them where they never see it coming. For decades, the Karamats grew richer, splashing their faces across magazines, politicians kissing their rings, their empire glowing like an untouchable fortress, until one night at a wedding, the kind of lavish affair where chandeliers trembled with crystal light, and the scent of roses dripped heavy in the air, Zoya and Saif returned, not as beggars, not as forgotten ghosts, but as predators dressed in silk, their presence a whisper, their plan a storm. And though no one knew it yet, though the music was loud and laughter even louder, the weapon the family had buried in shame and silence was about to be revealed. And when it struck, it would not only cut deep but cost them everything, millions upon millions, torn away not by bullets but by justice delivered in the language the Karamats understood best, money, power, and the taste of their own destruction. Revenge doesn't come knocking like a thief in the night. It walks through the front door dressed like an honored guest. And that's exactly how Zoya and Saif made their return, not with torches or accusations, but with handshakes and smiles polished by years of waiting. Saif had studied abroad, worked quietly in finance under false names, gathering knowledge like a blacksmith gathering sparks, while Zoya had carved her way into the elite social circles through art and philanthropy, her beauty and intelligence disarming the very people who had once turned their backs on her family. And so when they reappeared at Malik Rauf's grand wedding celebration, no one remembered them as the orphans cast into the cold. They were now the mysterious investors from Dubai, the elegant art curator from Paris, their accents softened, their clothes tailored to perfection, their arrival masked as opportunity, not vengeance. Malik Rauf, always hungry for fresh money to expand his already swollen empire, welcomed them with open arms, his arrogance blindfolding him from recognizing the same eyes that once looked up at him with despair, the same faces that had cried on the steps of his mansion. Zoya leaned in with charm, her laughter like velvet wrapping around his greed, and Saif spoke numbers that glittered in Malik's imagination, whispering of international projects and endless profits, and soon enough, contracts were signed, hands were shaken, and the Karamat fortune began to intertwine with the very blood it had once betrayed. But beneath every signature, beneath every glass of wine raised in celebration, was a thread of venom woven carefully into the fabric of the deal. For Saif had built shell companies like traps, funds that looked legitimate, but were hollow chambers designed to collapse at the right moment, while Zoya infiltrated the family's social reputation, recording secrets whispered in drunken confidence, collecting scandals like beads on a string, affairs, bribes, tax evasions, dirty money trails that could turn empires into ash with just one headline. To the world, they were saviors of the Karamat dynasty, injecting modernity and global partnerships, but to each other, they were hunters circling their prey, each move rehearsed in silence, each smile sharpened like a blade, and though Malik Raf thought he was absorbing them into his empire, what he didn't realize was that the empire itself had become the weapon, a weapon his own arrogance had handed over to the very family he had tried to erase, and soon, the cost of that blindness would be tallied not in rupees or dollars, but in humiliation, loss, and betrayal so poetic it would echo like thunder across the generations. To empires don't collapse with a bang at first. They whisper, they tremble, they leak like glass hairline fractures no one notices until the whole mirror shatters, and that was how the Karamat dynasty began to unravel under the gentle hands of Zoya and Saif. It started with numbers, always numbers, small discrepancies in accounts Malik Raf never cared to check. Because greed makes men lazy, and Saif knew precisely how to feed that laziness, planting figures that promised soaring profits, while bleeding the empire quietly into offshore accounts controlled by him, until millions began vanishing without alarms, disguised as investments, into fake projects in faraway lands. Meanwhile Zoya was setting fire to their reputation without anyone seeing the smoke, moving through charity galas and art exhibitions with her quiet grace, slipping rumors into conversations like poison in tea, rumors about Malik's bribes, his mistresses, his deals with politicians, all so carefully placed that they never pointed back to her yet grew roots in the minds of journalists hungry for a scandal. And in the Karamat household, the chaos was multiplying. Malik's sons fought over control, suspicious of each other as Saif whispered suggestions in their ears, driving wedges into already fragile egos, while Zoya befriended Malik's wife, planting seeds of doubt about her husband's loyalty, until the woman's bitterness boiled over into public outbursts, further cracking the family's image. And yet, even as the dynasty shook, Malik Raf refused to see the storm forming. He was too busy posing for photographs, too busy signing deals he barely understood, convinced he was untouchable, because men like him believe curses are only fairy tales, never realizing that some curses are carved into the very bloodlines they wound. The first real blow came when an international audit was forced upon one of Malik's flagship companies, and suddenly millions were unaccounted for, projects exposed as fraudulent, politicians scrambling to distance themselves, and the press descended like vultures circling a wounded animal, their headlines screaming corruption, betrayal, collapse, and Malik's empire, once the pride of the nation, began to look like a rotting carcass behind the scenes. Saif watched with cold satisfaction, his calculations unfolding perfectly, while Zoya, standing in front of her mirror late at night, whispered to the ghost of their mother, "Do you see, Amma? Our silence has become the blade, and it is cutting them where it hurts the most." The chaos doesn't arrive politely, it storms in, ripping chandeliers from ceilings, and by the time Malik Raf finally smelled the smoke, his empire was already burning. Lawsuits began piling up on his desk like funeral flowers, banks demanded explanations, and the politicians who once bowed to him now avoided his calls, their loyalty evaporating faster than spilled perfume. And in the boardroom, his sons turned into wolves, accusing each other of betrayal, their shouts echoing through marble halls while Zoya and Saif quietly poured oil on the flames, whispering half-truths into the right ears, ensuring that suspicion grew into rage. One son leaked private documents to journalists, another sold company shares to competitors, and Malik, once the puppeteer, now stood tangled in his own strings, powerless as his legacy fractured in public view. But the true weapon, the sharpest blade, was Zoya's timing, because just as Malik scrambled to extinguish financial fires, she revealed her trump card, a series of recordings, carefully edited, leaked anonymously, capturing Malik's voice in meetings with corrupt officials, his promises of illegal land grabs, his laughter as he dismissed the very villagers whose lives he had destroyed decades ago. And when those recordings hit the airwaves, It was not just money that crumbled but reputation, and reputation is the currency no dynasty can afford to lose. Newspapers painted him as a tyrant in silk, protests erupted outside his offices, and the very name, Karamat, turned poisonous, a symbol of greed and betrayal. His wife left him, his friends abandoned him, and even the servants who once lowered their eyes now whispered curses as he passed. For there is a peculiar justice in watching the mighty fall. It is not the speed of the collapse that satisfies, but the dignity stripped away piece by piece until nothing remains but shame. Safe, sitting in a quiet cafe far from the chaos, watched the news on a cracked television, his face expressionless save for the twitch of a smile, while Zoya stood at the window of their rented flat, staring at the city lights, whispering again to the silence, "Do you feel it, Amma? The same silence you carried, the same silence we endured. Tonight it has spoken, and the world is finally listening." Malik Rauf had tried to bury them in silence, but silence had risen like a tide, drowning him in his own sins, and yet this was only the beginning, for what he thought was ruin was merely the overture, the first act of a tragedy that would strip him not just of millions, but of everything he once believed could never be taken. A cornered king is the most dangerous, and Malik Rauf, though stripped of allies and haunted by scandal, was not yet willing to surrender his crown. Desperation became his new weapon, and with trembling hands he tried to rebuild what was already crumbling, calling in favors, bribing judges, threatening journalists, and summoning his fractured sons to unite under his command. But loyalty built on fear dissolves when the fortress falls, and the sons who once obeyed him now saw weakness where they once saw power. Each scheming for his own slice of the broken empire, Malik raged like a storm, throwing glasses against walls, swearing that the world had conspired against him. But deep in his chest he carried a suspicion that he could not silence. That someone somewhere was orchestrating his fall with precision too sharp to be coincidence. It was then that he launched his counterattack, hiring private investigators, shadowing business rivals, digging through financial records, desperate to find the phantom hands behind the curtain. And though he uncovered fragments, shell companies, anonymous accounts, whispers of foreign investors, he could not trace them back to Zoya or Saif, because their plan had been crafted with the patience of decades, every path leading him deeper into a labyrinth designed to exhaust him. And yet, Malik was not entirely blind, for when he saw Zoya again at a social gathering, her smile soft but her eyes unflinching, something inside him stirred, a flicker of recognition, a ghost of a memory. Those same eyes, red from crying, standing at the gates of his mansion all those years ago. The realization stabbed him, but pride refused to let him admit it, so instead he tried to charm her, to draw her close, unaware that every word he spoke was being recorded, every promise of revenge, every confession of regret feeding into the arsenal she and Saif were building. Meanwhile, Saif tightened the financial noose, orchestrating a stock market crash in which Malik's companies lost billions overnight, their value evaporating like mist, and the world called it bad luck, poor management, the price of arrogance. But Malik knew better. He felt the invisible hand pressing on his throat, and the more he struggled, the deeper he sank, until paranoia consumed him, until his own reflection in the mirror felt like a spy. Still, he swore to fight, swore to rise again, because men like him do not believe in defeat. They believe in survival at any cost, even if it means dragging everyone else into the abyss with them, and that promise, that refusal to die quietly, would only ensure that when the final blow came, it would be all the more devastating. For Malik Rauf was no longer just a fallen tycoon, he was a desperate king in a crumbling castle, clawing at the stones as the tide rose higher, blind to the fact that the very sea swallowing him was blood from his own betrayed kin. Money can be rebuilt, empires can be reshaped, but once pride is broken, a man becomes hollow, and Zoya knew this truth better than any swordsmith knows the balance of his blade. So while Saif strangled Malik's fortune in silence, she set her sights on the one thing he could never rebuild. His image, the crown he wore so proudly before the world. Malik Rauf had always lived for appearances, the cameras flashing, the handshakes with ministers, the charity galas where he posed as a savior while villages starved under his greed. And Zoya chose to dismantle this mask with surgical precision, starting with whispers that turned into headlines, an exposé revealing how Malik's so-called charitable trust had siphoned millions into offshore accounts, how his schools for the poor had been ghost buildings where no children ever studied, and how the scholarships he bragged about were given only to relatives of politicians. The nation that once hailed him as a philanthropist now spit his name with disgust, and the fall from grace was not quiet. It was televised, debated, dissected, his face plastered on screens as a symbol of corruption. His voice played in recordings where he mocked the very people whose votes he had bought. And then came Zoya's masterstroke, a documentary, released anonymously, woven with the testimonies of those Malik had crushed. Farmers who had lost their land, workers who had been silenced, and even former mistresses discarded like broken dolls, each voice a nail in the coffin of his reputation, each tear a mirror to his crimes, until the public no longer saw him as a man of wealth, but as a vulture dressed in silk. Malik raged, he cursed, he threatened lawsuits, but the courts had already turned against him. Judges now eager to prove their impartiality, by punishing the very man they once dined with, and politicians who had once clung to his shadow, now stepped into the light of his ruin, condemning him to save themselves. And through it all, Zoya never showed her face, never let her name be tied to the storm she had conjured. She moved like a phantom, her revenge not in the spotlight but in the silence behind it, knowing that true justice is not about being seen, it is about being felt, and Malik felt it deeply, in the collapse of his dignity, in the silence of his empty halls, in the stares of strangers who now recognized him not as a king, but as a fallen fraud. And at night, when his fury had no audience, Malik Rauf sat alone, staring into a glass of whiskey he could not finish, whispering to himself, "Who is doing this to me? Who has turned the world against me?" But the answer was already in his blood, in the faces he had once erased, the very family he had tried to bury now standing over his grave of pride, shoveling silence upon him until he could no longer breathe without choking on shame. When an empire collapses, it rarely falls from the weight of enemies, it crumbles because of betrayal within, and for Malik Rauf, that betrayal arrived not from strangers but from his own blood. His eldest son, once groomed as heir, sold confidential shares to foreign competitors in exchange for immunity. His second son leaked financial records to prosecutors in hopes of saving himself, and the youngest, too reckless to scheme, turned to gambling and drugs, dragging the family name deeper into filth. Malik, furious and heartbroken, tried to gather them back under his wing. But what fatherhood he once possessed had long ago been replaced with tyranny, and now the sons who once feared him only saw a wounded lion, vulnerable and bleeding. Zoya and Saif fed this disunity with whispers so subtle they felt like natural consequences, introducing doubts into conversations, manipulating allies into adversaries, until the Karamats no longer needed outside enemies to fight. They devoured themselves, tearing flesh from bone, clawing for whatever scraps remained. Malik's wife, humiliated by the scandals and revelations, filed for divorce, dragging him through the courts with claims of abuse and infidelity, her testimony echoing the very truth Zoya had uncovered. And the public, already baying for his blood, now saw him not as a patriarch but as a coward, a man who had destroyed not just the world around him but the home within. Banks froze his accounts, prosecutors froze his assets, and the empire he once held in the palm of his hand dissolved like sand through open fingers, leaving him grasping at nothing but rage. Still, Malik refused to believe his downfall was natural. He ranted about conspiracies, about vultures feeding on his legacy, about enemies who had plotted against him for years, and though he could not prove it, his heart knew the truth. It was family, the very blood he had cast out, the children of the brother he had disinherited, the orphans he had left to rot, come back as shadows in the night. And that realization burned him more deeply than any court verdict ever could, for to lose millions is one wound, but to know that your ruin was crafted by your own kin, that the silence you once forced upon them had ripened into a weapon sharp enough to carve your empire to the bone, that was the betrayal Malik Rauf could never swallow. And in the stillness of his empty mansion, surrounded by echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to him, he finally understood the curse of his mother's warning, that what is stolen in blood will return in blood, and what is built on silence will one day be destroyed by it. Ted's humiliation is the true grave of the powerful, for wealth may return and alliances may shift, but dignity once stripped never grows back, and Malik Rauf learned this as he stood in court, not as the untouchable king he once was but as a defendant drowning under evidence so damning it felt like destiny itself had conspired against him. The prosecutors painted him as a monster in silk, the newspapers shredded him daily, and the very public that once cheered his name now spat it with venom, their chants echoing outside the courthouse like drums of war. Malik tried to fight, barking at his lawyers, pounding the table, shouting his innocence, but every document presented, every recording played, every photograph displayed was a nail in the coffin of his legacy, and though he demanded to know who was orchestrating it all, no name was ever spoken aloud. for Zoya and Saif remained phantoms, their revenge unfolding from the shadows with surgical precision. And yet, fate, or perhaps justice, chose that the mask should finally fall because one evening, as Malik exited the courthouse flanked by cameras, a journalist shoved a microphone at him and asked a question so sharp it sliced through the noise. "What would your late brother say if he saw you today, Mr. Karamat?" And in that instant, Malik froze, for behind the crowd, beyond the sea of flashing lights, he saw them, Zoya and Saif, standing tall, not hiding, not disguised, their eyes steady, their silence louder than any accusation, and though no one else recognized them, Malik did, with a clarity that pierced his soul. The children of the man he had destroyed, the orphans he had erased from his family's history, now stood before him not as beggars but as executioners, their weapon not guns or knives but patience, intelligence, and an unbroken memory. His mouth went dry, his hands trembled, and for the first time in his long reign of arrogance, Malik Rauf felt fear, not of prison, not of poverty, but of the reckoning written in their eyes, for they had become living proof of the curse he had sown. And their very existence in that moment was the final verdict the world needed. Cameras captured his stutter, his collapse, the sweat beading his forehead as he tried to regain composure, but the image of the once mighty Malik Rauf shrinking under the silent gaze of two forgotten hairs became the defining picture of his downfall, shared across screens, newspapers, and whispers in tea-houses. And though the court would take months to deliver its sentence, Malik's true punishment had already been handed down, not by the judge, not by the law, but by the ghosts of his own blood who had returned to strip him of the last mask. He had left the mask of invincibility. Ta-da! When the gavel finally struck, it did not echo like a simple wooden block, it thundered like judgment itself, sentencing Malik Rauf not only to years behind prison walls, but to the eternal loss of his empire, his fortune seized, his properties auctioned, his name blacklisted from every corridor of power. And though the world cheered at the verdict, calling it justice, for Malik it was more than punishment. It was erasure, the very fate he had once condemned his brother's family to, now mirrored back upon him with cruel precision. In prison, stripped of silk and gold, he became just another old man in gray, his arrogance rotting in the smell of iron bars and cheap soap, his eyes hollow, haunted not by the guards who barked orders, but by the memory of Zoya and Saif's silent gaze, the reminder that his fall had not come from strangers, but from the blood he had betrayed. And outside those walls, Zoya and Saif stood together, watching the headlines blaze with victory, their mother's words echoing in the silence of their shared triumph. "One day, our silence will be the blade." Yet as the cheers of the world grew louder, a different silence began to grow between them, a heavy truth that revenge does not heal. It only balances the scales. Saif felt it first, the emptiness in his chest where satisfaction should have been, realizing that while they had avenged their father, no court could return the years stolen from them, no ruin of Malik could bring back the laughter of a childhood cut short. And Zoya too, in the quiet of the night, stared at her reflection and asked herself whether justice had been worth the decades of plotting, whether carrying the blade of silence had made her free, or had chained her more deeply to the pain of the past. For though Malik was ruined, though the empire had crumbled, the scars on their souls remained, reminders that vengeance is never clean. It stains even those who wield it. Yet when doubt threatened to overwhelm them, they returned to the gravesite of their mother, knelt by the earth that had received her tears, and spoke into the stillness. "Ama, we kept our promise. He can no longer hurt anyone." The wind stirred through the trees like an answer, and though they knew the ache would never fully fade, they also knew that their silence, their patience, had given voice to the voiceless, had exposed a tyrant, had carved justice where none seemed possible, and in that knowledge lay not joy but peace, a quiet victory that did not glitter but endured. And perhaps that, in the end, was the true weapon of their family, the ability to endure, to wait, to strike not with fury but with unbreakable will. Sadada stories like this do not end with parades or fireworks, they end in silence, the kind of silence that follows after storms, when the ground is soaked and the air still smells of thunder. And that was how Zoya and Saif carried their revenge into the future, not as a crown of triumph but as a scar that whispered of the cost. Malik Rauf died years later inside prison walls, not with dignity, not with family, but alone on a rusted bed, his last breath rattling against the same silence he had once forced upon others. And though the newspapers carried his obituary, no one mourned him. He was a name that had become a warning, a shadow parents used to caution their children, "Build with honor, or you too will fall like a Karamat." The empire was gone, divided among creditors and rivals, its mansions abandoned, its name wiped from buildings that once bore it in shining letters. But the true inheritance left behind was not the rubble of Malik's fortune. It was the lesson etched into the memory of those who had watched him rise and fall. A lesson that silence can be sharper than steel, that patience can be more devastating than power, and that betrayal within family is the deepest wound of all. Zoya and Saif never sought to build their own empire from the ashes. They chose instead to live quietly, investing in schools, in hospitals, in the very villages their uncle had once exploited, not as philanthropists seeking applause, but as children fulfilling a promise to their mother. Using the weapon of silence not for destruction anymore, but for healing, turning their family's curse into a legacy of restoration. Yet even in their peace, they carried the weight of what had been done, for revenge does not free, it binds, and though justice had been served, they knew the echoes of their choices would ripple through generations, shaping how their own children understood the meaning of power and forgiveness. And so the story of the Karamats became a whispered tale, told in hushed tones at weddings and funerals, a cautionary saga of how arrogance can blind, how silence can sharpen, and how a family's weapon, once revealed, can cost not just millions but everything. Because empires rise and fall, fortunes swell and vanish, but the wounds of betrayal carve themselves into bloodlines, and the silence of the wronged waits patiently, always patiently, until the day it speaks, and when it does, the world listens because silence once broken is the loudest sound of all. Da.